The moment a king rejects the wrong woman, an entire kingdom begins counting down to its own reckoning. Moonhall had never been so silent. Hundreds of alphas, betas, and omegas filled the towering chamber beneath crystal chandeliers carved from ancient ice, their eyes fixed on the marble platform where King Rowan Blackwood stood in ceremonial black trimmed with silver. Behind him, the great wolf crest of the Northern Kingdom stretched nearly 30 feet across the stone wall, glowing beneath shafts of pale moonlight pouring through towering stained glass windows. Every year the choosing ceremony brought hope, celebration, and new beginnings. This year it carried something no one expected. Clara Whitmore stood at the very end of the line, dressed in a simple ivory gown that looked painfully modest beside the jeweled dresses worn by the other Omegas. She had long ago stopped caring about whispers following her wherever she walked. Broken Omega, Moonless Girl, the one who could never shift. She had heard every cruel nickname before her 20th birthday. At 24, they no longer hurt. They only reminded her how little people understood what they feared. Her grandmother, Eleanor Whitmore, watched quietly from the upper gallery with folded hands, her weathered face hiding an uneasiness she could not explain. She had prayed this day would never come, not because Clara would be rejected, but because destiny had finally reached the child she had spent an entire lifetime protecting. Counselor Victor Vale stood beside the royal throne with an unreadable expression. His sharp eyes never left Clara for more than a few seconds. Unlike everyone else in the chamber, he was not watching to see whether the Alpha King would choose her. He was waiting to see whether something far older would awaken. Rowan stepped forward, his powerful voice carrying effortlessly through the enormous hall. Tonight, the moon bears witness as the bond of the future Luna is revealed. The ceremonial crystal resting upon the stone altar began glowing with soft silver light. One by one, names were called. Each Omega approached, placed her hand upon the crystal, and stepped away as the light faded. Nothing happened. Murmurs spread through the crowd. The final name echoed through the chamber. Clara Whitmore. A few nobles exchanged amused smiles. Someone quietly laughed. Clara walked forward without lowering her head. Every step echoed across polished marble. She placed her hand upon the ancient crystal. For one breath, nothing happened. Then the hall exploded with light. Brilliant silver radiance burst upward, illuminating every pillar, every banner, every astonished face. The wolf crest above the throne shimmered as though awakened from centuries of sleep. Gasps rippled across the chamber. A glowing thread of moonlight stretched through the air until it reached Rowan's chest. The bond had chosen. The impossible had happened. The weakest Omega in the kingdom had been recognized by destiny itself. Rowan stared at the glowing connection between them. His wolf stirred uneasily inside him, but instead of trust, doubt filled his mind. He looked at Clara's simple clothing, at the absence of noble jewels, at the quiet woman who had never once transformed into a wolf, and then toward the hundreds of eyes waiting for his decision. Madison Vale smiled confidently from the front row, certain the king would never accept such humiliation. Rowan slowly lifted his chin. Clara Whitmore, he said, his voice calm enough to wound more deeply than anger ever could. I reject you as my Luna. A stunned silence swept through Moonhall. Several Omegas covered their mouths. Others looked away, unable to watch what they expected would happen next. Every rejected bond in history had ended with tears, pleading, or complete emotional collapse. Victor Vale watched Clara with growing intensity instead of satisfaction. Eleanor quietly closed her eyes. Rowan waited for Clara to break. Instead, something completely unexpected happened. Clara smiled. Not a bitter smile. Not a mocking one. A peaceful smile filled with unmistakable relief. Then she laughed. The sound was soft at first, almost gentle, yet it echoed through the enormous chamber with impossible clarity. Confusion spread across every face. Madison frowned. Rowan's expression hardened. Do you find this amusing? He asked. Clara looked directly into his silver eyes. No, she answered softly. I find it freeing. At that exact moment, an unfamiliar warmth spread beneath the skin over her heart. It moved like sunlight breaking through frozen water, dissolving invisible chains she had never known existed. A voice, ancient beyond memory yet strangely familiar, whispered inside her soul. At last. Clara's laughter faded as the sensation grew stronger. Somewhere deep beneath Moon Hall, ancient stone trembled almost imperceptibly. Hidden beneath centuries of dust, a forgotten carving of a white wolf surrounded by stars began glowing with pale blue light. No one inside the hall noticed except Victor Vale. The color drained from his face. His carefully controlled breathing faltered for the first time in decades. Eleanor opened her eyes and saw the fear in his expression. She knew immediately what it meant. The secret she had buried for 24 years had finally awakened. Clara slowly withdrew her hand from the crystal. The silver bond between her and Rowan shattered into countless sparks before disappearing into the air, yet instead of leaving emptiness behind, it felt as though an invisible door inside her had quietly opened. She glanced once toward the moonlit ceiling, where the stained glass wolves seemed almost alive beneath the glowing light, then looked back at the Alpha King with unexpected serenity. "Your Majesty," she said gently, "one day you will understand that you did not reject me." Her smile returned, calm and unshaken. "You rejected the last chance your kingdom ever had." No one moved. The laughter that had escaped Clara Whitmore's lips seemed to linger inside Moon Hall long after the sound itself had disappeared, settling over the gathered nobles like an unanswered question. The glowing crystal upon the altar slowly dimmed until only the pale moonlight streaming through the towering stained glass windows illuminated the chamber once more. Every eye remained fixed upon the young Omega who had just accepted the greatest public humiliation of her life with a smile no one could explain. Rowan Blackwood stood motionless upon the royal platform. He had rejected countless petitions, settled disputes between rival pacts, and delivered judgments without hesitation, yet nothing in his years as Alpha King had prepared him for the quiet certainty in Clara's eyes. It was not defiance. It was not sorrow. It looked almost like relief. That unsettled him far more than tears ever could have. Madison Vale stepped forward with a graceful smile that barely concealed her satisfaction. "Your Majesty," she said brightly, allowing her voice to carry across the hall, "perhaps we should continue the ceremony. Surely the moon would never expect the future Luna to stand here after such an unfortunate misunderstanding." Several nobles nodded in agreement, grateful for someone willing to break the heavy silence. Clara turned her head toward Madison, her expression remaining gentle. "You are right about one thing," she said calmly. "The ceremony should continue." Madison blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the absence of anger. She had expected pleading, embarrassment, perhaps even resentment. Instead, she found herself facing someone who appeared strangely untouched by rejection. Rowan studied Clara carefully. "You may leave," he said in an even tone. "The ceremony is over for you." Clara inclined her head respectfully. "Thank you, Your Majesty." She reached slowly toward the silver pendant resting against her collar, the emblem every Omega belonging to the Northern Kingdom received upon reaching adulthood. For years it had represented loyalty to the crown and trust in the ancient order that governed every pack. Without hesitation, she unclasped the chain and placed the pendant upon the polished stone altar beside the fading crystal. The tiny sound of silver touching marble echoed through the silent chamber with startling clarity. Murmurs swept through the audience. An elderly noblewoman whispered, "She cannot leave without the royal emblem." Another quietly answered, "No one has ever surrendered it voluntarily." Clara rested her fingertips against the cool stone for one brief moment before stepping away. She did not ask permission. She did not seek approval. She simply walked toward the towering doors at the far end of Moon Hall with calm, measured steps. Madison's pleasant smile finally disappeared. "Stop," she called sharply. Clara paused, but did not turn around. A rejected Omega should kneel before the Alpha King before departing. "Surely you remember our customs." The entire chamber waited. Rowan remained silent, allowing the ancient tradition to speak for itself. Clara slowly looked over her shoulder. "Respect that is freely given has meaning," she replied softly. "Respect demanded through humiliation becomes something else entirely." Madison's cheeks flushed. "You dare question our traditions?" Clara's blue eyes remained steady. "No, I only question whether they still remember their original purpose." Before Madison could answer, she instinctively allowed a trace of alpha authority to slip into her voice. "Kneel." The command carried through the hall with the familiar invisible pressure every wolf understood. Several younger Omegas nearby instinctively lowered their heads. A few servants stiffened where they stood. Yet Clara did not move. She felt the unseen force brush gently against her like a passing breeze before dissolving into nothing. Surprise flickered across her face, not because she had resisted it, but because she had not needed to try. The strange warmth inside her chest expanded quietly, wrapping around her heart like sunlight after a long winter. Somewhere deep within her mind, the ancient voice returned, calm and patient. No chain remains. Clara drew one slow breath. I cannot obey a command that no longer reaches me. The words were spoken so quietly that many wondered whether they had imagined them. Madison stared in disbelief. Alpha commands had governed wolf society for centuries. No Omega had ever simply ignored one. Rowan's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. He had felt the command leave Madison. He had also felt it fail. That should have been impossible. High above the chamber, Eleanor Whitmore closed her trembling hands together. The first seal had broken exactly as the old records had foretold. She whispered a silent prayer that no one else would recognize the signs before she could get Clara away from the palace. Only one person truly understood what had just happened. Counselor Victor Vale concealed his alarm behind years of practiced composure, yet his pulse quickened beneath the elegant robes of office. He glanced toward the ancient stone floor beneath the throne, where forgotten carvings slept beneath centuries of polished marble. If the second seal awakened as well, the truth buried for generations would no longer remain hidden. Clara resumed walking. Every step felt lighter than the one before. The heavy loneliness she had carried since childhood seemed to fall away piece by piece, leaving behind an unfamiliar feeling she struggled to name. Freedom. As the massive doors of Moon Hall slowly opened before her, a cool evening breeze drifted inside, carrying the scent of pine forests and approaching rain. Just before she crossed the threshold, a sharp cracking sound echoed through the chamber. Everyone turned instinctively toward the royal platform. A thin fracture had appeared across the base of the ancient stone throne. Barely visible, yet unmistakably real. No earthquake followed. No second crack appeared. The hall fell silent once again. Rowan stared at the fracture without understanding why an uneasy feeling settled deep within his chest. Clara never looked back. She stepped into the moonlit night beside her waiting grandmother, and together they disappeared beyond the palace gates while, far beneath the foundations of the kingdom, something ancient that had slept for hundreds of years quietly opened its eyes. The moon hung low above the northern forest as Clara Whitmore and her grandmother walked in complete silence along an overgrown trail that had not been used in decades. Behind them, the lights of the royal capital slowly disappeared beneath the dark hills until only the pale silver glow of the night remained. The cool autumn air carried the scent of cedar, damp earth, and distant rain, yet Clara noticed something she had never sensed before. Every breeze seemed filled with countless whispers. She could hear water flowing somewhere nearly a mile away. She could distinguish the wings of an owl gliding silently between the towering pines. Even the gentle rustling of leaves sounded impossibly clear. She slowed her steps, placing one hand against the trunk of an ancient oak tree. The rough bark felt strangely alive beneath her fingertips. "Grandmother," she whispered, "what is happening to me?" Eleanor Whitmore stopped walking and looked at her granddaughter with eyes filled equally with sorrow and relief. For 24 years, she had feared this conversation, praying Clara might live an ordinary life untouched by the burden carried through generations of forgotten blood. Yet she had always known the truth could only remain hidden until destiny decided otherwise. "Come," Eleanor said quietly. "There is something you should have seen many years ago." They continued deeper into the forest until the trees opened into a small clearing bathed in moonlight. At its center stood an abandoned stone chapel wrapped in climbing ivy and surrounded by towering white birch trees. Time had weathered the walls, and the wooden doors leaned slightly from their hinges, yet an unmistakable sense of peace lingered around the forgotten sanctuary. Clara had passed nearby as a child but had never been allowed inside. Tonight, Eleanor pushed open the heavy wooden door without hesitation. Dust drifted through beams of moonlight pouring from cracks in the ancient roof. Rows of worn wooden benches faced a simple stone altar carved with symbols Clara had never seen before. They were not wolves like those decorating the royal palace. These creatures were leaner, their bodies surrounded by stars instead of crowns, their eyes lifted toward the moon rather than toward a throne. Clara found herself drawn toward the altar almost without thinking. As she stepped closer, the warmth inside her chest returned. The strange voice she had heard inside Moon Hall remained silent now, but its presence no longer frightened her. Instead, it felt patient, almost welcoming. Eleanor reached beneath the altar and pressed her hand against a weathered stone hidden from ordinary sight. A soft grinding sound echoed through the chapel. The floor slowly shifted aside, revealing a narrow staircase descending beneath the earth. Cool air carrying the scent of old parchment and cedar rose from the darkness below. Clara stared in astonishment. "There is a room beneath the chapel?" Eleanor nodded. "It has been hidden for nearly 300 years. They descended carefully until they entered a circular chamber illuminated by pale crystals embedded within the walls. Shelves filled with ancient books surrounded the room, while delicate silver carvings covered the ceiling in the shape of constellations. At the center rested a stone table upon which lay a single leather journal wrapped in faded blue cloth. Eleanor lifted it gently, as though holding something far more precious than gold. "This belonged to your mother." Clara froze. She had been told almost nothing about the woman who had died shortly after giving birth to her. Every question she had ever asked had been answered with quiet sadness or careful silence. Eleanor placed the journal into Clara's trembling hands. The worn leather felt warm despite the cool chamber. Inside the front cover, a graceful signature appeared in flowing ink. Amelia Whitmore. Beneath the name stood another phrase written in older script. "Daughter of the Aether Wolves." Clara looked up in confusion. "What does that mean?" Eleanor drew one slow breath before answering. "Your mother was never an ordinary Omega." The room seemed to grow even quieter. "The stories told throughout the kingdom say that every ancient wolf bloodline disappeared centuries ago," Clara said softly. Eleanor nodded. "Because that is what the councils wanted the world to believe." She walked toward one of the crystal walls where an enormous mural stretched from floor to ceiling. It depicted dozens of white wolves standing beneath a sky filled with stars. None wore crowns. None bowed before an alpha. They stood together as equals beneath the moon. "These were the Aether Wolves," Eleanor whispered. "They were never the strongest. They never ruled the largest kingdoms. Their gift was something far rarer." Clara stepped closer. "What gift?" Eleanor's eyes met hers. "Truth," she continued before Clara could speak. "An Aether Wolf cannot be controlled by alpha command. They sense deception before words are even finished. They choose loyalty freely instead of through fear, and they recognize the worth of a soul before they see power or titles." Clara's heartbeat quickened as memories rushed through her mind. Madison's command that had failed. The strange feeling of invisible chains breaking. The ancient voice. The glowing carving beneath Moon Hall. Then, Eleanor gently placed a hand upon her shoulder. "You are the last living descendant of that bloodline." The words settled over Clara like falling snow. She looked again at the mural, noticing that one wolf near the center had eyes almost identical to her own. If this bloodline still existed, she asked quietly, why was it hidden? Eleanor's expression darkened with old grief. "Because those who fear truth will always fear the people who can reveal it." At that exact moment, the journal in Clara's hands began glowing with faint silver light. The pages turned by themselves until they stopped at a single handwritten sentence left by her mother many years before. Clara read the words aloud in barely more than a whisper. "The day they reject you will be the day they can no longer imprison who you were born to become." As the final word left her lips, tiny strands of silver light drifted upward from the journal and quietly disappeared into the stars carved across the ceiling, while somewhere beyond the forest a lonely wolf called into the night for the first time in generations. Morning sunlight filtered through the broken stained glass windows of the hidden chapel, scattering ribbons of gold across the ancient chamber beneath the earth where Clara Whitmore still stood holding her mother's journal. She had not slept. Every page revealed fragments of a history that had been erased from every library inside the Northern Kingdom. The Aether Wolves had never ruled through fear, never demanded obedience, and never sought larger territories. Their strength had come from something no army could manufacture. They recognized truth even when it hid beneath perfect lies, And because of that gift, kings had once sought their guidance before making decisions that shaped entire generations. Clara gently traced the faded handwriting across one page, while countless questions filled her mind. If her people had been protectors instead of conquerors, why had they disappeared so completely? Eleanor Whitmore quietly arranged several old scrolls upon the stone table before looking toward her granddaughter. "History remembers whoever survives long enough to write it," she said softly. "Sometimes the truth is buried beneath centuries of comfortable stories." Clara slowly closed the journal. "Then someone wanted my family forgotten." Eleanor lowered her eyes. "Not forgotten. Feared." Before Clara could ask another question, an unexpected sound drifted through the hidden chamber. It was so faint that another person might never have noticed it. Somewhere above the chapel, a horse had stopped outside. Another followed. Clara instinctively looked toward the ceiling. "Someone is here." Eleanor froze. "You heard that?" Clara nodded. "At least 2 riders. One of them just stepped onto the old stone path." Eleanor exchanged a troubled glance with the hidden staircase. The riders were still far enough away that no ordinary wolf should have sensed them. "Your hearing has already begun changing," she whispered. "The awakening is moving faster than I expected." Moments later, another strange sensation passed through Clara. It was not a sound. It felt more like tiny ripples moving through the air around her. As Eleanor reached for one of the scrolls, Clara suddenly saw a soft silver glow surrounding her grandmother's words before they were even spoken. "We must leave before they—" Eleanor stopped mid-sentence. Clara stared in confusion. The silver glow faded as the sentence ended. "Grandmother," she asked carefully, "why did your words have light around them?" Eleanor's expression became very still. "Describe exactly what you saw." "It was like moonlight." Clara searched for better words. "Not around you. Around what you were saying." Eleanor's eyes filled with quiet emotion. "Because I was telling the truth." Clara looked down at her own hands. "You mean I can actually see it?" Eleanor slowly nodded. The first gift of the Aether Wolves was never extraordinary strength. It was clarity. Truth carries its own light. Deception carries its own shadow. Your senses are beginning to recognize both. Before Clara could fully understand, hurried footsteps echoed from above. An elderly caretaker pushed open the hidden entrance and descended the stairs with visible concern. "Lady Eleanor," he said while trying to steady his breathing, "royal riders have been searching every road leading away from the capital since dawn. They questioned everyone in the nearby villages." Eleanor thanked him quietly before he returned upstairs. Clara noticed something remarkable. Around every word the old caretaker had spoken shimmered the same gentle silver glow she had seen around her grandmother. He had not exaggerated. He had not concealed anything. He had simply spoken honestly. Eleanor gathered the journal and wrapped it carefully inside a wool cloth. "We cannot stay here much longer." Clara followed her toward the staircase, but before reaching the first step, she suddenly stopped. A sharp chill spread across the room, although every candle still burned steadily. Her gaze drifted toward the far wall where the mural of white wolves beneath the stars covered the ancient stone. One figure near the center seemed different now. Its carved eyes reflected pale blue light. Then the strange voice returned inside her thoughts, calm and timeless. "Look deeper." Almost without realizing why, Clara reached toward the mural. The instant her fingertips brushed the carved stone, another section of the wall shifted silently aside. Behind it rested a narrow alcove holding a polished crystal bowl no larger than 2 hands placed together. Inside lay a single silver feather unlike anything Clara had ever seen. It shimmered softly despite the absence of sunlight. Eleanor's breath caught. "I never knew this chamber existed." Clara carefully lifted the feather. The moment she touched it, a gentle warmth flowed through her fingertips and spread across her entire body. For an instant, countless unfamiliar images flashed through her mind. White wolves standing beneath brilliant constellations. Children laughing beside crystal lakes. Elders placing glowing feathers upon stone altars while promising never to force another soul to obey against their will. Then the visions disappeared as quietly as they had come. Clara remained motionless, her heartbeat steady despite everything she had witnessed. "I know this place," she whispered, "but I have never been here before." Eleanor looked at her with growing certainty. "You are remembering what your blood has carried." Far away inside Blackthorn Palace, Counselor Victor Vale stood alone before the cracked royal throne, studying ancient records locked away beneath the council chambers. One fragile parchment bore the faded seal of the Aether Wolves. Across its final line, written by trembling hands centuries earlier, appeared a warning he had spent his entire life hoping would never become reality. When the last descendant awakens, no throne built upon hidden lies shall stand forever. Victor slowly closed the document, and for the first time in many years, genuine fear settled behind his carefully controlled expression. 3 days passed before Clara Whitmore and Eleanor Whitmore reached the western edge of the forgotten Silver Pine Valley, a quiet place that no longer appeared on the official maps of the Northern Kingdom. Small cottages rested between ancient evergreens, their weathered stone walls softened by climbing ivy and wildflowers that somehow continued blooming despite the cool autumn air. Smoke drifted peacefully from old chimneys while children chased one another through narrow paths lined with apple trees. The village looked ordinary to anyone passing by, yet Clara immediately sensed something different. There were no alpha banners, no pack symbols, no carved wolf crests hanging above the doors. The people greeted one another with smiles instead of formal bows, and every conversation carried an unexpected feeling of ease. As Clara stepped onto the village square, dozens of unfamiliar voices reached her heightened senses all at once. At first the sound overwhelmed her, but then something remarkable happened. Without effort, each voice separated naturally from the others until she could understand every conversation without confusion. She heard an elderly woman comforting a frightened child after a nightmare. She heard 2 farmers discussing the coming frost. She heard a baker quietly setting aside an extra loaf of bread for a widow who could not afford to pay that week. Every honest word shimmered with the same soft silver glow she had begun seeing beneath the chapel. It no longer startled her. Instead, it filled her with a strange sense of peace. Eleanor smiled as she noticed Clara watching the villagers with quiet wonder. "They do not know who you are," she said gently. "They only know that another traveler has arrived." Clara nodded. Maybe that is enough. Before long, they were welcomed into a modest gathering hall where several families shared warm soup, fresh bread, and apple cider around a large wooden table. Nobody asked Clara whether she belonged to a powerful bloodline. Nobody questioned why she had left the capital. They simply offered her a place to sit. During the meal, a young boy accidentally dropped his wooden cup onto the floor. Embarrassed, he quickly bent to pick it up while apologizing over and over. Clara smiled and handed him a clean cloth before helping wipe away the spilled cider. His mother looked at her gratefully. "Thank you," she said. "Many visitors pretend not to notice small accidents." Clara laughed softly. Sometimes kindness begins with noticing the little things. The silver glow surrounding the woman's thankful words became brighter than before, and Clara realized something unexpected. The warmth inside her chest also grew stronger. Not because anyone admired her, but because she had chosen compassion without expecting anything in return. Later that afternoon, Clara walked through the village helping several elderly neighbors gather firewood before winter arrived. She repaired loose shutters on a small cottage, carried heavy baskets from the orchards, and spent nearly an hour reading stories to children gathered beneath an enormous maple tree whose leaves glowed with shades of gold and crimson. Every act felt natural. Every smile she received seemed to strengthen the quiet light within her instead of exhausting her. As sunset painted the valley with warm amber colors, Eleanor found Clara sitting beside a peaceful stream, watching fallen leaves drift across the water. "Do you feel it?" Eleanor asked. Clara looked up. "The warmth." Eleanor nodded. "Your gift grows whenever you choose generosity over pride." The Aether Wolves believed power existed to serve others, never to elevate themselves. Clara watched the flowing water in thoughtful silence. "Then strength is not something I take." Eleanor smiled. "It is something you awaken." At that very moment, far away inside Blackthorn Palace, King Rowan Blackwood stood alone before the cracked stone throne that had unsettled him since the choosing ceremony. Master craftsmen had examined the fracture repeatedly, yet none could explain why the ancient seat had weakened without any earthquake or visible damage. Rowan rested one hand against the cool stone, troubled by a feeling he could neither dismiss nor understand. Since Clara's departure, something else had changed as well. Every evening when he entered the throne room, The ceremonial moon crystal appeared slightly dimmer than it had the day before. Royal historians insisted the crystal had never lost its light in more than 5 centuries. Yet now its silver glow continued fading one quiet day at a time. "Your Majesty," an elderly archivist said carefully as he entered the chamber carrying several weathered scrolls, "I found records hidden beneath the oldest royal library." Rowan accepted the documents. Most described forgotten treaties, ancient harvest festivals, and ceremonies no longer practiced. One faded journal contained only a single sentence written in careful handwriting. "A kingdom may possess armies, walls, and crowns, but without truth it slowly forgets why it deserves to endure." Rowan read the line twice before looking toward the darkening crystal once again. He could not explain why Clara's calm smile returned to his thoughts every time he looked at the growing crack beneath the throne. For the first time since becoming Alpha King, he wondered whether the greatest mistake of his reign had not been choosing the wrong Luna. Perhaps it had been failing to recognize the quiet worth of someone who had never asked for power in the first place. As night settled across Silverpine Valley, Clara stood beneath a sky filled with brilliant stars. She closed her eyes and listened. Instead of countless scattered voices, she heard something deeper. Beneath the whispering trees and flowing stream came the faint heartbeat of the valley itself, steady and peaceful, as though the ancient land had quietly begun recognizing the final daughter of a forgotten people and welcoming her home. The first frost covered Silverpine Valley before sunrise, painting every branch with delicate crystals that shimmered beneath the pale morning light. Clara Whitmore stepped outside the small cottage where she and Eleanor Whitmore had been staying, breathing deeply as the crisp mountain air filled her lungs. The valley felt different today. Every heartbeat of the forest seemed clearer. Every bird calling across the treetops sounded as though it were standing only a few feet away, and beneath those familiar sounds, she sensed something else. It was not a voice. It was a quiet invitation rising from the ancient land itself. She followed the feeling along a narrow path winding between towering pines until she reached a peaceful meadow surrounded by white stone pillars weathered by countless seasons. Wild grass swayed gently despite the cold, and at the center of the clearing rested a circular pool so still that it reflected the morning sky like polished glass. Clara instinctively stopped walking. She had never seen this place before, yet every part of her heart insisted she had somehow returned rather than arrived. Eleanor appeared several moments later, carrying Clara's mother's journal beneath her arm. She smiled softly as she watched Clara standing beside the water. "Your ancestors called this the Mirror Spring," she explained. "Every child of the Aether Wolves came here during their awakening." Clara lowered her eyes toward the perfectly still water. Instead of seeing only her reflection, she noticed faint silver ripples spreading across the surface, although no breeze disturbed the pool. "What am I supposed to do?" she asked quietly. Eleanor opened the journal to one of its final pages. "Nothing extraordinary," she answered. "Only be honest." Clara looked at her in surprise. "That is all." Eleanor nodded. "The greatest gift your people ever possessed was never strength. It was the courage to face truth without looking away." Clara slowly knelt beside the spring and rested her fingertips upon the cool surface. Tiny circles expanded across the water, carrying shimmering light toward the stone pillars surrounding the meadow. The warmth she had carried since leaving Moon Hall spread gently through her arms before settling peacefully within her chest. Images began appearing across the mirror-like surface. She saw children laughing beneath the stars while elders taught them to listen before speaking. She saw strangers welcomed with warm meals instead of suspicion. She saw wolves laying aside their pride to settle disagreements through wisdom instead of fear. None of the visions showed conquest or crowns. They showed ordinary moments filled with quiet dignity. Tears gathered in Clara's eyes, not from sadness, but from recognizing values she had unknowingly carried throughout her own life. The ancient voice returned, softer now than ever before. "Power follows character." Clara closed her eyes and whispered, "I understand." At that instant, the silver feather she had discovered beneath the chapel began glowing inside the pocket of her cloak. Gentle streams of light rose into the morning air before dissolving among the frosted branches above. Eleanor watched in silent amazement as several strands of Clara's golden hair reflected pale silver beneath the sunlight for a brief moment, before returning to their natural color. It was not a dramatic transformation. It felt more like the quiet acknowledgement of something finally remembered. Miles away inside Blackthorn Palace, King Rowan Blackwood stood upon the eastern balcony overlooking his kingdom. The early morning should have brought comfort, yet an unfamiliar emptiness lingered throughout the palace. Servants carried out their duties with practiced precision, but laughter seemed strangely absent from the halls. The cracked throne remained untouched because no craftsman dared attempt another repair after every previous effort had failed. Rowan found himself reading the ancient journal borrowed from the royal archives again and again, searching for answers hidden between faded lines. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Counselor Victor Vale entered carrying several official reports. "Your Majesty," he said smoothly, "our scouts have found no sign of Clara Whitmore. It would be wise to turn our attention toward more urgent matters." Rowan studied him quietly. For reasons he could not explain, the counselor's reassuring words left him uneasy. Since the choosing ceremony, he had begun noticing small inconsistencies. Answers that seemed complete, yet somehow incomplete. Advice that sounded reasonable, yet felt strangely hollow. He remembered Clara's calm expression when she had spoken about freedom, and for the first time he questioned whether certainty and truth were always the same thing. "Continue searching," Rowan said firmly. Victor hesitated almost imperceptibly before inclining his head. "As you wish." After the counselor departed, Rowan remained alone on the balcony watching clouds drift across distant mountains. Somewhere beyond those peaks lived the woman he had believed too ordinary to become his Luna. Yet every passing day seemed to prove how extraordinary her absence truly was. Back in Silver Pine Valley, Clara rose from the mirror's spring feeling lighter than she ever had before. Villagers greeted her warmly as she returned, asking whether she would help prepare the community gathering that evening. She accepted with a grateful smile, spending the afternoon arranging long wooden tables, carrying baskets of fresh apples, and decorating the village square with evergreen branches. Children laughed as they followed her from one task to another, eager to imitate every small act of kindness she offered. As twilight settled across the valley, Clara looked around at the people sharing food, stories, and simple joy without caring who possessed titles or status. She realized that the life she had always searched for had never required a throne. It required a place where truth was welcomed, kindness was remembered, and every soul was free to choose who they wished to become. High above the gathering, the first evening star appeared in the darkening sky, shining directly above Silver Pine Valley, as though quietly announcing that the last daughter of the Aether Wolves had finally begun walking the path that had always been waiting for her. The peaceful rhythm of Silver Pine Valley changed just after sunrise on the 8th day. Clara Whitmore was helping several children gather baskets of late autumn apples when every bird resting among the tall pines suddenly lifted into the sky at once. The valley fell unusually quiet. Even the gentle breeze seemed to hesitate. Clara looked toward the northern ridge long before anyone else noticed anything unusual. Through her awakened senses, she could hear distant hoofbeats echoing across the mountain trails nearly 2 miles away. Calm voices followed, mixed with the steady sound of leather reins and traveling gear. There was no fear hidden among those sounds, only determination. She slowly placed the basket onto the ground. Eleanor Whitmore noticed the change in her expression immediately. "Someone is coming," Clara said softly. Eleanor listened but heard only silence. "How many?" "6 riders." Clara closed her eyes for a moment. "One of them carries a burden heavier than armor." Eleanor's face grew thoughtful. "Your gift continues to deepen." By the time the riders finally appeared at the entrance to the valley, the villagers had already gathered peacefully near the old stone bridge. No one carried weapons. No one prepared for conflict. Silver Pine Valley had never answered strangers with fear. At the front of the small group rode King Rowan Blackwood. His royal cloak was dusted with the pale frost of many days spent traveling through forests and mountain roads. The polished confidence that had surrounded him during the choosing ceremony had quietly faded. Long hours beneath open skies had softened the certainty in his eyes, replacing it with honest reflection. As he dismounted from his horse, he looked less like an untouchable ruler and more like a man searching for an answer he should have sought much sooner. Clara stepped forward with calm composure. She wore the same simple traveling cloak she had arrived with, though something about her presence had changed in ways no fine clothing could explain. She stood with quiet confidence, her blue eyes clear beneath the morning light, while the children who had been helping her remained comfortably nearby, instead of hiding behind the adults. Rowan noticed that immediately. Trust like that could never be demanded. It could only be earned. Their eyes met across the stone bridge. For a long moment neither spoke. The valley itself seemed to wait. Finally Rowan broke the silence. "I have been looking for you." Clara offered a small respectful nod. "I know." He studied her face carefully. "You seem different." A gentle smile touched her lips. "Perhaps I finally stopped trying to become someone I was never meant to be." Rowan lowered his gaze for a brief moment before looking back at her. "I came because I owe you the truth." Clara did not answer immediately. Instead, she quietly watched him, and something remarkable happened. Around every word he spoke, she saw a soft silver light, steady and genuine. There was regret in his heart, but no deception. It was the first time she had looked upon the Alpha King without the shadow of expectation standing between them. Rowan continued, his voice calm and sincere. "Since you left, nothing inside the kingdom has felt right. The ancient moon crystal continues losing its light. The throne itself has cracked, and every old record I uncover seems to point toward forgotten history that no one will explain." He paused before speaking again. "I should have listened instead of judging what I could see." Clara looked toward the flowing stream beneath the bridge. "Sometimes we mistake familiarity for truth," she said softly. "The two are not always the same." Rowan nodded slowly. "I understand that now." Before either of them could continue, another group approached from the southern road. Unlike Rowan's small company, these newcomers wore the formal robes of the Royal Council. At their head walked Counselor Victor Vale. His expression remained composed as always. Yet Clara immediately noticed something she had never witnessed before. Around his greeting no silver light appeared. Instead, faint shadows gathered along the edges of every word, drifting through the cold morning air before disappearing. "Your Majesty," Victor said smoothly, inclining his head toward Rowan before turning to Clara. "Miss Whitmore, the Council has been deeply concerned for your safety." Clara quietly met his eyes. The shadows surrounding his voice grew darker. "Have you?" she asked gently. Victor smiled with practiced courtesy. "Naturally. You belong within the kingdom." The shadow deepened again. Clara felt no anger, only certainty. Eleanor stepped beside her granddaughter, silently recognizing the expression forming across Clara's face. Rowan looked from Victor to Clara with growing confusion. He could not see what Clara saw, yet he sensed the subtle change in the atmosphere. "There is something neither of you has told me," he said carefully. Clara looked back at the Alpha King. "There has always been something." Victor's calm expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Your Majesty," he interrupted smoothly. "The Council strongly advises returning to the capital immediately. Certain matters are far too sensitive to discuss here." Clara heard the sentence. She also saw the darkness surrounding every word. For the first time since her awakening, she fully understood what her ancestors had meant. Truth carried light. Lies carried shadows. She lifted her eyes toward the quiet mountains surrounding Silver Pine Valley, and the ancient voice within her whispered only 4 simple words. "Now you can see." Clara looked calmly at Rowan once more. "If you truly came searching for the truth," she said with quiet conviction, "then you must be willing to hear everything, even the parts your own kingdom buried long before either of us was born." The journey back to the royal capital began beneath a gray autumn sky that seemed to mirror the uncertainty resting over everyone traveling the northern road. Clara Whitmore rode beside Eleanor Whitmore in a simple wagon borrowed from the villagers of Silver Pine Valley, while King Rowan Blackwood and his small company followed without royal ceremony or unnecessary display. Counselor Victor Vale remained unusually quiet throughout the trip, his composed expression never changing even as Clara continued noticing the faint shadows surrounding nearly every sentence he spoke. She no longer questioned what she was seeing. The gift of the Aether Wolves had become as natural as breathing. By the time the towers of Blackthorn Palace rose above the distant hills, word of Clara's return had already spread throughout the kingdom. Nobles, pack leaders, and representatives from neighboring territories filled Moon Hall once again, drawn by rumors that the rejected Omega had returned carrying secrets older than the throne itself. Clara stepped through the enormous doors without hesitation. Weeks earlier, she had walked out of the same hall believing she had lost everything. Today, she entered carrying nothing except her mother's journal, the silver feather wrapped safely inside her cloak, and the quiet confidence of someone who no longer needed another person's approval to know her own worth. Rowan took his place before the ancient throne, but did not sit. The narrow fracture running through the stone remained clearly visible beneath the moonlight streaming through the stained glass windows. Victor moved toward the center of the hall with practiced authority. "Members of the council," he announced smoothly, "we gather today because dangerous claims have been made regarding forgotten bloodlines and ancient legends. For the safety of every pack, these matters must be settled before uncertainty divides the kingdom." Clara watched him carefully. Around every polished sentence, dark shadows drifted like smoke before dissolving into the air. They were stronger than ever. Rowan noticed Clara studying the counselor. "You asked me to hear the truth," he said. "I am listening." Victor turned toward Clara with a courteous smile that never reached his eyes. Then perhaps Miss Whitmore would explain why she abandoned her kingdom only to return with stories that challenged centuries of recorded history. Clara calmly stepped forward. "History is valuable," she replied gently, "unless it has been rewritten by those who feared what it contained." Quiet murmurs spread across the chamber. Victor folded his hands. "Extraordinary accusations require extraordinary proof." Clara slowly opened her mother's journal. The aged pages rested quietly in her hands as she lifted them for everyone to see. "This is not proof by itself," she admitted. "It is only one voice from the past. But truth rarely stands alone." She looked toward the enormous wolf crest carved above the throne. "May I ask a question instead?" Rowan nodded. "You may." Clara turned to the gathered nobles. "How many of you have ever seen the complete founding records of this kingdom?" Confused glances passed from one council member to another. No one answered. Victor finally spoke. "Many ancient documents were naturally lost through time." The shadows surrounding his words deepened. Clara smiled sadly. "No, they were hidden." Eleanor quietly stepped beside her granddaughter and placed several carefully preserved scrolls upon the central stone table. Their seals matched the symbols carved beneath the forgotten chapel. Rowan stepped forward and examined them closely. The wax bore the image of a white wolf surrounded by stars instead of a crown. "These records describe agreements between the first Alpha Kings and the Aether Wolves," Eleanor explained. "Your ancestors never ruled alone. Every ruler accepted guidance from those who could not be controlled by fear or command." Rowan carefully unrolled the oldest scroll. Its faded ink remained surprisingly clear. The opening lines described a covenant stating that no alpha would govern without accountability to those devoted solely to truth. His expression slowly changed as he continued reading. "This seal," he whispered, "it matches carvings beneath the palace." Victor's calm mask finally showed the smallest crack. Ancient myths often resemble official symbols. Clara lifted her eyes toward him. "Then why did the council order every reference to the Aether Wolves removed from public records 180 years ago?" Silence filled Moon Hall. Victor answered immediately. "That never happened." Thick shadows gathered around his words, darker than anything Clara had witnessed before. Without thinking, she raised one hand. The silver feather inside her cloak began glowing with gentle light, and tiny strands of pale radiance drifted into the open air. They settled around Victor's last sentence, revealing the darkness wrapped around it for only a brief heartbeat before everyone present. Gasps echoed through the chamber. Even those unable to understand the miracle sensed something undeniable had appeared before them. Rowan stared in astonishment. "What is that?" Clara lowered her hand slowly. "Truth revealing what deception tries to hide." Victor took one involuntary step backward, genuine concern replacing practiced confidence for the first time in decades. Rowan looked from the glowing feather to the ancient scrolls and finally toward the counselor he had trusted throughout his reign. The certainty that had guided him for years suddenly felt fragile. He closed the scroll with deliberate care before speaking in a calm voice that carried across the silent hall. "No one leaves Moon Hall until every hidden record beneath this palace has been brought into the light." As those words settled over the gathering, the cracked throne behind Rowan released a quiet sound, and a second fine fracture appeared beside the first, as though the ancient stone itself had begun responding to a truth that could no longer remain buried. Moonhall remained silent long after the second fracture appeared across the ancient throne. No one dared speak. The fading moon crystal above the royal platform shimmered weakly, casting pale light over the gathered nobles whose certainty had begun crumbling alongside the stone that had symbolized the kingdom for centuries. King Rowan Blackwood stood motionless, the forgotten scroll still resting in his hands. For the first time since inheriting the crown, he understood that authority without truth was only an empty performance repeated often enough to resemble tradition. Slowly he stepped away from the throne and descended the marble steps until he stood upon the same floor as everyone else. There was no distance between ruler and subject now, only people facing the consequences of choices made across generations. He turned toward Clara Whitmore, who remained calm despite hundreds of eyes watching her. The soft silver light surrounding her presence no longer felt mysterious. It felt reassuring, like the first clear morning after a long storm. Rowan lowered his head. "Everything I believed about this kingdom was incomplete," he said quietly. "I judged you by what I thought strength should look like instead of asking who you truly were." Clara listened without interruption. Around every word he spoke, the familiar silver light appeared once again, steady and sincere. There were no shadows, no hidden motives, only regret honestly acknowledged. Rowan continued, "I cannot erase what happened inside this hall, and I will not ask you to pretend it never happened. But I can choose what kind of king I become after today." With deliberate care, he removed the royal crown from his head and placed it upon the stone table beside the ancient covenant of the Aether Wolves. Gasps spread throughout Moonhall. No Alpha King had ever voluntarily laid aside the crown during a public gathering. A throne supported by forgotten lies does not deserve unquestioned loyalty, Rowan declared. Until every hidden record is restored and every truth is made known, this crown will remain here. Counselor Victor Vale stared in disbelief as years of carefully guarded influence slipped beyond his reach. He opened his mouth to object, but no words came. The silence surrounding him was heavier than any argument. One by one, members of the council lowered their eyes, recognizing that history itself had begun changing before them. Eleanor Whitmore stepped toward the center of the chamber and gently placed the final bundle of preserved records beside the crown. "The Aether Wolves never sought to replace kings," she said softly. "They existed to remind rulers that power without compassion eventually loses both." Her words settled over the hall like quiet wisdom remembered after being ignored for far too long. Rowan looked toward Clara once more. "The covenant says your people had the right to judge whether a ruler remained worthy of leading." Clara slowly shook her head. "The covenant gave us the responsibility to protect truth, not to own the future." She turned her gaze toward the nobles gathered throughout the chamber. "I did not return to claim revenge. I returned because every child born after us deserves a kingdom built upon honesty instead of fear." She paused before continuing. "No Omega should ever be valued only when chosen. No Alpha should ever believe authority places them above accountability. No council should ever erase voices simply because they are inconvenient." Her calm words carried farther than any shouted command ever could. The fading moon crystal above the throne suddenly brightened. Its silver light spread slowly across the chamber until every carved wolf upon the ancient walls seemed to awaken beneath the gentle glow. At the same moment, the fractures running through the throne stopped expanding. They did not disappear. They remained visible, permanent reminders that even repaired foundations should never forget what once broke them. Several months passed, and the kingdom changed in quiet but meaningful ways. Hidden archives were opened to every scholar willing to preserve the complete history of the Northern Kingdom. The names of the Aether Wolves returned to official records exactly as they had once been written. New laws ensured that every mate bond required mutual choice rather than silent expectation, and Alpha Command could never again be used to force personal submission outside legitimate protection of the community. Rowan spent those months traveling through villages instead of remaining inside palace walls, listening far more often than he spoke. He no longer measured strength by appearances because he had learned how easily true character could be overlooked. Clara chose not to live within the palace. Instead, she returned often to Silverpine Valley, where she continued helping families, teaching children the forgotten history of their ancestors, and reminding anyone willing to listen that kindness was not weakness, but one of the rarest forms of courage. Sometimes she visited the capital to advise the council when truth required another voice. But she always returned to the quiet valley before nightfall, because that was where she had discovered who she truly was. One clear evening beneath a sky filled with brilliant stars, Rowan met Clara beside the old stone bridge where their paths had crossed again after so much had changed. Neither wore ceremonial clothing. Neither carried symbols of rank. They stood simply as two people shaped by difficult choices. Rowan offered a respectful smile. "Thank you for refusing to become bitter." Clara looked toward the peaceful river reflecting the moon above. "Bitterness would have chained me to the past," she answered gently. "Freedom began the moment I chose something better." Rowan nodded with quiet understanding. They stood together in comfortable silence while the water continued its endless journey beneath the bridge. Above them, the first evening star appeared exactly where it had on the night Clara's true path began. She smiled, no longer because rejection had set her free, but because she finally understood that the last daughter of the Aether Wolves had never been chosen by destiny to restore an old world. She had been entrusted with the chance to build a kinder one, where truth would always shine brighter than fear, and where every heart would remain free to choose the life it deserved.